Thank you so much for joining us for this live broadcast. We're going to start in just a few seconds as the audience joins us. Again, thank you wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us at Honest Reporting. We have exciting news to report tonight and look forward to sharing that with you in just a few seconds. Wherever you're joining us from, thank you so much. It's wonderful to have all of you here. Just yesterday, I did a live Facebook video for Honest Reporting, and we talked about the possibility of, will there be a unity government? Will we go to a fourth election? And I ended off by saying, I hope that next time I speak to you, it will be about a unity government. So I have wonderful, wonderful news to share with all of you, and that is that a unity government deal has been signed for Israel. After 15 months of a political stalemate where we went through 3 election cycles, we are finally in a position where we will have a wide-ranging unity government. As I'm explaining that government to you, please feel free to ask any questions that you have in the comments below. And after we finish the broadcast, I'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you. So let's talk about this unity government and what exactly is involved. The number one compromise that took place here is that Benjamin Netanyahu from the Likud party and Benny Gantz from the Blue and White party, after election cycle after election cycle of beating each other up and lots of mudslinging one to the other, they put all that aside and they're willing to sit together in a unity government. The structure of that unity government is that Netanyahu will serve as the prime minister for the first 18 months of the government. During that time, Benny Gantz will serve as his vice prime minister, if you will. He'll also be defense minister. And then after 18 months, this will take place probably November 2021, by the time the deal is fully signed. By November 2021, they will rotate, and Benny Gantz will become the prime minister of Israel. He'll become the 13th prime minister of Israel. And at that point, Netanyahu will become the vice prime minister, and he'll be a member of the security cabinet as well. Just that compromise alone is significant. It's an unbelievable compromise. Benny Gantz was saying the whole time, we can't serve together with a prime minister who's under indictment and going to trial. And Netanyahu said along the whole time that Gantz is not fit to be prime minister. And yet the two have put that aside, saying that at this point in time, especially with the coronavirus crisis, Israel must have a unity government, and therefore they are going to work together to deal with the health crisis, to deal with the economic crisis, and they'll put aside all the issues they had one with the other during the campaign. Now, it's not so simple for all of this to happen, and there are other things that had to happen along the way. So, for example, Netanyahu is serving as deputy prime minister in November 2021. Israeli law at the moment says that you are allowed to serve as prime minister if you are under indictment, but you are not allowed to serve as a regular minister in the Israeli government under indictment. So how will Netanyahu be the deputy prime minister? He's going to be a minister in the government. How can he possibly do that if the law doesn't allow it? Blue and White has agreed to pass legislation. This will have to be what the initial act of this government that will say you are allowed to serve as the deputy prime minister and as a member of the security cabinet if you are under indictment. Netanyahu will be doing all of this while in trial. That is a compromise that Blue and White had to make in order for this government to work. That's one issue which they were able to deal with. But now there was another issue they had to deal with. Gantz is very concerned, and all of his party, that what will happen as we get towards the end of the 18 months of this unity government, when the rotation is supposed to take place, perhaps Netanyahu will then pull the Likud out of the government. He'll collapse the government, and Gantz won't have a chance to be the prime minister. The rotation won't take place. In order to protect them from that happening, they are putting in legislation which is going to say that if someone between these two sides pulls out of the government, in this case it would be Likud, pulls out of the government, robbing Gantz of the opportunity to be the prime minister, at that point, the new election, which is supposed to kick in automatically when there's no government, will not take place. The other person, in this case Gantz, will automatically become the prime minister, and the election will be pushed off for 6 months. That will give Gantz 6 months as prime minister leading into the election. It will mean that he'll be the interim prime minister after the election, and that is a way to protect, to make sure that the rotation actually takes place, even if Netanyahu tries to stop it from happening. There was one more concern about this rotation, and this was Netanyahu's concern, and that is the following. Israeli law does allow a prime minister to continue serving even if he's indicted. It's unclear what the law says about a candidate forming a government, becoming prime minister while under indictment. And there are already, it happened already, 3 groups that complained to the Supreme Court. Netanyahu knew that would happen. And Netanyahu has a fear that the Supreme Court might rule that he's not allowed to be the first prime minister in this rotation. He cannot form a government because he's under indictment. Netanyahu was asking Blue and White to agree that if that would happen, if the court would rule that way, that they would pass a law to circumvent the decision of the court and allow Netanyahu to continue as prime minister. Benny Gantz and Blue and White was not willing to do that. They're not going to pass a law to circumvent the court, but they have agreed that if the Supreme Court rules that Netanyahu cannot form the government, if that happens, then they agree to automatically go to a new election. And trust me, the court will have that in mind as well when they are issuing their decision. By the way, these groups already complained to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has given Gantz, Netanyahu, Likud, Blue and White, the Attorney General, till Thursday at 2 p.m. to issue their responses, and there will be a hearing about this issue, about whether or not Netanyahu is allowed. Can he form the government while he is under indictment? So that's the issue of the rotation. And that's, most people, when they ask about this government, they ask, who is the prime minister? How is this going to work? That has been solved through all the measures which I shared with you right now. There was one other major stumbling block that was really the major obstacle to forming the new government, and that was the issue of judicial appointments. To give you the background, over the last 5 years, there have been very conservative right-wing justice ministers who have gone through a process of reforms within the judiciary. Many conservative judges have been put onto the courts. There have been reforms made in terms of the relationship between the courts and the legislative body of the Knesset. And Blue and White is concerned about the Knesset overreaching itself too far into the judiciary. They want to make sure that it remains independent. And they insisted on a justice minister named Avi Nissenkorn, who was the former labor union chief from the far left wing, and he's their candidate for justice minister. Likud has agreed to that. You talk about compromises. They agreed to Nissenkorn becoming the justice minister, but Likud wanted to make sure, they actually demanded veto power over judicial nominations. Blue and White was not willing to give them that veto power, and that's why these last few days has been a struggle to figure out a solution. And they came up with a compromise which says that one of the members of Knesset that is going to be on the committee to choose judges is member of Knesset Tzvi Hauser. Why is that significant? Tzvi Hauser, on the one hand, was a former cabinet secretary for Netanyahu. Ideologically, he's in the right wing and conservative, but he has also been very vocal against those who attack the courts and wants to make sure that the courts have their power and their strength. And therefore, he's viewed as that person who can represent both sides when it comes to the judicial nominations. And therefore, they were able to find a solution to that problem, and that enabled them to move forward with the unity government. Now, they're calling this government initially an emergency government, an emergency 6-month government, during which time they're going to focus primarily on the economic and health issues related to the coronavirus crisis. That is the primary focus for these initial 6 months. No one is going to be moving forward with any trailblazing legislation. They want to get things settled in the country. During those 6 months, the two sides will negotiate and work on what will be the policies of the government for the remaining 30 months of this government. So there's an interim period over here. However, there was one exception that was made to this idea of this interim period with nothing major taking place. And that relates to Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank or Jewish areas in the West Bank in Judea and Samaria. If you remember, the plan which President Trump put forth for the Mideast and for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict did allow for Israel exercising its sovereignty over Jewish areas in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. There are hundreds of thousands of Jews that are living in these areas. And Likud very much wants to move forward with that, especially while President Trump is in office. We don't know what's going to happen in the November election in the United States. So there's a window of opportunity, as they call it, for this to take place. Blue and White was hesitant about allowing this to happen. We want to make sure that we don't shake things up too much in the Middle East. Will it impact our peace treaty with Jordan? And Blue and White is compromised. And they are allowing, starting July 1st, that's the date they've given, so that is during these 6 months of the interim emergency government, so to speak, they are allowing Likud to bring a plan for annexations, for sovereignty over some areas, all areas. We'll have to see how that plays out. They're allowing them to bring that to the Knesset floor, assuming that there is U.S. support for such action. And the deal between Likud and Blue and White is that Blue and White members who are adamantly against this do have the right to vote against it in the Knesset, but Likud knows that there is a majority between the Netanyahu's right-wing religious bloc and those in Blue and White who are in favor. There is a Knesset majority to pass that legislation, and therefore that is the one exception that was made for significant legislation, and that is a very significant development if that happens. Certainly there are those who are in favor of it, those who are against it, and there will be a lot of strong debate in the Knesset about it, but that is the agreement which they made of one piece of legislation which can move forward during this 6-month emergency unity government period. Like I said, during the 6 months, they'll work on what the policies are going to be moving forward for the remaining 30 months of the government in terms of pulling the country in one way or another. I will tell you there is a clause in the agreement, in the Unity Coalition agreement, which does address one other area of legislation. And that is actually an area of legislation which has led to the collapse of Israeli governments. It played a role in the instability that we had leading up to these 3 election cycles. And that is the issue of the draft to the army of the ultra-Orthodox. It's a long story, which we're not going to get into all the details right now, but it's been decades old controversy in Israel as the religious side, the ultra-Orthodox insists that these years of the army years, their young men are studying in the rabbinic seminaries and the yeshivot, and it's not the time for them to serve in the military. The rest of the country is saying we want equality. Everyone serves in the military. There has been an agreement to pass legislation related to this issue, legislation that was authored by the Defense Ministry. But there's one clause in there which actually favors the ultra-Orthodox, and that is that the government will determine the quota, how many young men in this population have to be entering the army from their institutions every single year before there are any kind of ramifications, specifically economic ramifications for their institutions. So that gives the government control over this issue, and the ultra-Orthodox parties will be part of the government, and therefore, on the one hand, they will pass a law, but no one's expecting it to have any major ramifications on the ground in terms of what happens in terms of ultra-Orthodox joining the military. One thing I will notice, though, is that in the coalition agreement, it does not talk about religion and state issues. Usually, the ultra-Orthodox parties demand, before they join a government, that it'll provide them status quo, as they call it, with religion and state issues, no major movement towards the secular population, towards removing religious elements in Israel. At the moment, that's not in the coalition agreement. Is it possible that when Netanyahu sits down with the ultra-Orthodox parties, they'll demand that? We'll have to see. I actually have my own theory, and this is just my own theory, that it could be that there's been a lot of controversy in Israel about the ultra-Orthodox population during this coronavirus situation. And they were lax originally when it came to some of the rules, and that actually led to, sadly, tragically, an outbreak of the virus in some of the ultra-Orthodox areas. Perhaps they felt this was not the time to be making demands. We're focusing now on a unity government to deal with the coronavirus, and maybe at some point later, they'll talk about the religion and state issues. That takes us, now we know there's not going to be any major earth-shattering legislation. It's going to be a focus on the coronavirus situation. And I did mention, of course, the possibility of sovereignty or annexation in the West Bank. That takes us to the issue of ministries. This government is going to be a very large government. In fact, at the end of the story, it'll be the largest government in Israeli history. There's certainly criticism from the opposition about this, that how during this economic crisis is this happening? The response of the government is this is what we needed to do to be able to make sure we had two sides equally represented in a government. Just to give you a sense for what the division is going to look like, the Blue and White Party is going to hold the ministries of Defense, that's going to be Gantz in the beginning. Foreign Affairs for the first 18 months. Gabi Ashkenazi is going to be the foreign minister, and then after 18 months, he'll become the defense minister. The ministries of justice, as we mentioned before, immigration and absorption. By the way, the candidate for that position at the moment appears to be member of Knesset Penina Tamanu-Shata from the Ethiopian Israeli population. She'll be the first female minister from that population. Ministries of culture and sport, communications, that was also important for Blue and White. There was controversy with Netanyahu and him intervening with communications and the media in Israel. This provides them that safeguard. Agriculture, strategic affairs, tourism, social equality, science and technology, and diaspora affairs. Many of you are watching from the diaspora. Blue and White, we don't know who the minister will be yet, but they will have the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. They're also creating a new ministry, a ministry for minority affairs in Israel. And Benny Gantz has said that he's going to appoint a professional minister from the Arab population to be the minister of that ministry. So that's that department in the government, and that's certainly an interesting development. The Labor Party. We're talking about a unity government from right wing to left wing. Israel's Labor Party is joining this government as part of Gantz's bloc, and they're going to be given the economic and the welfare ministries to deal with these social ministries. Those are the ministries that Gantz and his bloc are going to have. The Likud is going to control the Ministry of Finance. During the campaign, there was a lot of talk about Nir Barakat, the former mayor of Jerusalem, heading that ministry. It appears now that's going to be going to Israel Katz, who is currently the foreign minister. They will also have the ministries of public security, transportation, housing, the environment, intelligence, regional cooperation, the periphery, energy, Jerusalem affairs, and foreign affairs for the second 18 months of this 36-month government. In addition, the Likud is going to be holding the position throughout the entire term, all 36 months of Speaker of the Knesset. That's going to go to Yariv Levin, who is a former tourism minister from Likud. Likud is going to then give a few other ministries to their partners. They have the ministries of the Interior, Health, and Religious Affairs. Those will most likely go to their ultra-Orthodox partners, and that rounds out those ministries. You'll notice I didn't mention one ministry, and that is the Education Ministry. And you'll notice I didn't mention a right-wing party called Yamina, led by current Defense Minister Naftali Bennett, and their 6 seats. At the moment, Yamina is out of the equation. They were not given ministries with a high enough portfolio for what they felt they deserved. Again, right now they have the Defense Minister and the Education Minister. They also are ideologically against some of the compromises that Likud has made. So it's yet to see, will Yamina join the government with their 6 seats or not? So at the moment, the education portfolio will be held by Likud, and they're also holding it out. If Yamina will join the government at some point, they will be given the education ministry. So that's in terms of that. Committees in the Knesset, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to give you a sense of the primary committees, the agreement gives Gantz control over the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee and the House Committee, which is in charge of most of what takes place within the Knesset. So that's important, especially since Likud is going to have the Speaker of the Knesset. It was important for Gantz to have control over the House Committee. Likud is going to have control over the Finance Committee. It's not necessarily going to be someone from Likud. They might give it to Moshe Gafni from the ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism Party. They will also head the special committee for the coronavirus crisis. There's a special committee that's been appointed to deal with that. Likud will head that committee. There's been some controversy about that because usually a committee that's doing oversight over the government, you would think it might come from the opposition so they can really do proper oversight. At the moment, the agreement says it's in Likud's hands, and the hope certainly is that the committee, as the parliament always has to do, will do its oversight over the government and how it deals with it. Ambassadorships, just the important ones for people around the world. Netanyahu is going to have control over who serves as ambassador to the United Nations, to the United Kingdom, to France, and to Australia for the entire lifespan of this government. So he will have control over it for that entire time over those ambassadorships. The ambassador to the United States is going to be under the control of whoever is prime minister. So Netanyahu will start as prime minister. Presumably he will continue with Ron Dermer as his ambassador. After 18 months, when the rotation takes place, Gantz at that point will be able to appoint his ambassador, to the United States. So we're talking about a very large government, which is going to start at 32 ministries. It's a lot. At some point, though, it's going to be expanded to 36. There's a possibility for as many as 16 deputy ministers, 8 from each side. So again, like I said before, the largest government in Israel's history. If you think about it for a moment, Benny Gantz is in a tough situation because he's getting all these ministries, but he doesn't have that many members of Knesset to get these ministries. He's only coming in with 15 to 17 in his block. If you add labor, 19 in his block, and he's getting 15 ministries. So there are going to be some professional appointments to ministries, but they're also going to pass what's called the Norwegian law, which allows ministers to resign their seat as members of Knesset. And that allows the next people in their faction on the list to come in and serve as members of Knesset. And that will give him members of Knesset who are focusing entirely on the parliament and the committees, while other members of his party are going to be in their ministries. Likud also has a lot to deal with now because they don't have that many ministries to give to many, many people who view themselves as possible minister candidates. Certainly some will become chairman of committees. They will also give out ambassadorships, I assume, to some of those members of Knesset who are ready for a promotion who will not be able to receive that promotion. That takes us to the opposition. In any healthy democracy, you have the coalition and you have the opposition. The opposition, the way it looks, will be led by Yair Lapid, who is the chairman of Yesh Atid and Telem. They used to be part of Blue and White, but they broke away from Blue and White because they're against joining a government led by Netanyahu. So Yair Lapid, as the head of that party, he is most likely going to be the head of the opposition. He'll meet with visiting dignitaries when they come to Israel. He will speak at some of the major events in the Knesset as well. He will be joined in the opposition by the joint list. That's the Arab parties. I always emphasize this point when there's a discussion about democracy in Israel and the joint list not being part of the government. They are in the Knesset. They are in the parliament. They will be deputy speakers from their party. They will be involved in committees, perhaps even ahead of a committee. It's important to point out the joint list will be in the opposition. Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party will be in the opposition. And at the moment, at least, you will have Yamina, led by Naftali Bennett, in the opposition as well. So the way it looks at the moment, we're talking about 72 seats in the coalition, 48 seats in the opposition, and we'll have a very vibrant democracy. You'll hear the opposition screaming and yelling against the policies of the government, and you'll certainly have the government moving forward with the agenda of this wide unity government. I want to end with just 2 points. There's one part of the unity agreement which to me is so beautiful and so inspiring and so important, and that is Gantz and Netanyahu have agreed to establish what they're calling an appeasement, reconciliation, unity cabinet within the government to focus on bridging the gaps in Israeli society. We've had 15 months of elections, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of populations going against other populations, and they're all agreeing it's time to bring that tone down and try to find a way for reconciliation. They'll have a special cabinet focusing on that. That's a beautiful, beautiful element, which I hope sparks the tone of this entire government, which we certainly hope lasts its full term of the 36 months. And remember, if that happens, there's an amazing development in Israel, and that is Netanyahu no longer as prime minister as he's been for so many years, and a new person, a former IDF chief of staff, Benny Gantz, being in that position in November 2021. The other thing I want to mention is whenever we talk about politics in Israel, we talk about this whole process. On the one hand, it's been very complicated and difficult. It reminds us, though, that Israel is a democracy. We are heading now into the week that's going to take us to Memorial Day in Israel, where we memorialize and remember the sacrifices that have been made for us to have this country. Those sacrifices were made for us to be able to have a Jewish and a democratic state that we're so proud of. And this is an example of that at work as they're trying to put together the compromises that are necessary to have this wide-ranging unity government from right to left, from religious to secular, and representing so many different populations in Israel. I think it's a very, very positive step for us to recognize this unity and this democracy at work in Israel. Then we go from Memorial Day into Independence Day, where we celebrate the incredible development that we have here, this vibrant democracy here in the Middle East, and everything we've seen over the last 15 months, everything we've seen over the last few weeks as this government has been put together. As we'll see the next week or so, the government's probably not going to be sworn in until into May, after we finish with the Memorial Day and the Independence Day, and all the little details are worked out. So we're seeing democracy at work, and we'll see it once the government is sworn in and the government tries to do what it wants to do, and the opposition fights against it and tries to present an alternative as we head towards the next election, which will be hopefully in the full 36 months. I thank all of you for joining us. I wish you, as we go through this week, a meaningful Memorial Day week, and then certainly happy Independence Day as we celebrate together this remarkable development called the State of Israel, this Jewish democratic state in the 21st century. And we thank you for being part of that conversation. Feel free, as I mentioned before, if you have any questions from what I've presented, ask those questions in the comments, and I'll make sure to take the time now to answer them. At this point, I'll be signing off. Thank you again for joining us at Honest Reporting, and look forward to the next update as developments in Israel warrant it. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.